Ladies and gentlemen, before I proceed, I must say of a very important development. I have been informed by someone I know who has an authoritative and has inside knowledge of the workings of the US Congress about the Resolution 413, that it will not be sent to the Senate for a vote or send it to the signature of the President to be signed into law. It is great news, and therefore it cannot be enacted. However, as I got this news at the 11th hour, I would like to proceed with my speech as planned. You never know, for some reason or other, which I cannot envisage, things may change. Honorable members of the Congress, dear friends and Tamil brothers and sisters, on May 18, 2021, 11 members of the US Congress, 9 Democrats and 2 Republicans, introduced Resolution 413 to the 117th Congress, which expressed recognizing 12 years since the end of the war in Sri Lanka. The proposed resolution holds Sri Lanka accountable in honoring the lives lost and expressing support for justice, accountability of the missing and civilians victimized, reconciliation, reconstruction, reparation, and reform in Sri Lanka to ensure a lasting, peaceful political solution and a prosperous future for all people of Sri Lanka. The House, on the 20th May of 2021, referred the resolution to the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central, and Asia Non-Proliferation for further action. If the subcommittee passes this bill or the resolution, the next step would be to forward the resolution to the Senate to sign it to law, which allows US to act unilaterally that impedes the sovereignty of Sri Lanka. I vehemently oppose and challenge the spirit and the substance which it projects. And this is my way of expressing the concerns and objections for the resolution, which I find has no factual basis. As a citizen of the United States of America and Sri Lanka, the Resolution 413 consists stringent stipulations which prescribes and gives the authority to the United States to explore or to conduct investigations, and it urges the United States to work with the United Nations General Assembly the United Nations Security Council and the United Nations Human Rights Council to establish a credible and effective international mechanism for accountability for the grave crimes committed during the war in Sri Lanka. It also gives United States to explore, investigate, and prosecute pursuant to the recommendations of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Setting a perfect precedence and antecedents, a model and a template to intrude upon the affairs of any sovereign country under the disguise of investigating human rights violations, be able to use by the use of Resolution 413. The Resolution 413 resolved that the House of Representatives acknowledges the 12th anniversary of the end of the war in Sri Lanka and offers its deepest condolences to all those affected by the conflict, honors the memory of those who died, and reaffirms its solidarity with the people of all communities in Sri Lanka in their search for reconciliation, reconstruction, reparation, and reform. It commends the United Nations Human Rights Council for prioritizing the collection and preservation of evidence related to human rights violations, a process that must not be interfered with by the government of Sri Lanka, which is a blatant violation of the UN Charter. UNHRC consists of 47 member states. The 48th session will be held on the 13th September to 1st October of 2021. Control and patronage by the rich and powerful nations that were established to prevent such bullying, intimidation, powers of the rich and the powerful countries over poor and military and economically weak nations. However, with no regard to these principles, US Congress has taken the reins of justice without conforming to the UN Charter by presenting the Resolution 413 to its approval by the House Congress. Sri Lanka, through its ambassador in Washington, His Excellency Mr. Ravinatha Aryasinghe, formally called on the US House Foreign Affairs Committee not to proceed with the House Resolution 413 on Sri Lanka. The resolution calls upon the Foreign House Committee to take note of the OISL report, a mandated investigation on Sri Lanka by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Violations and the recommendations of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which the United States co-sponsored the UNHRC resolution with Sri Lanka in 2015, which was reaffirmed in 2017 under HRC 30-1, stroke 1. In this resolution 30-1, the Sri Lankan government agreed to adhere to transitional provisional justice commitments to post-war reconciliation, including accountability, with establishing a special court housed with foreign judges, prosecutors, lawyers, and investigators. A truth commission, an office of missing persons, office of reparation, and institutional reforms aimed at non-recurrence. This was a grave blunder by the then government to have agreed for such a leeway for submitting to foreign interference with the aims of Sri Lanka, a sovereign democratic republic, a nation with all the so-called judicial proviso and elements which are in place to serve the people of the country and to comply with the United Nations Charter and the UNHRC decorum, etiquette, and the protocols. Honorable members of the Congress and dear friends, unlike rich nations and with military might, policing the weak nations and controlling the global economies and lobbying to win over the favorability of their policies, whether right or wrong, communist or democratic, terrorist or freedom fighters, and by geopolitical factors such as military bases strategically situated. Sri Lanka has not projected its ambitions to stretch out its dominance to any country, race, ethnicity, or religion. Former UN Ambassador Tamara Kunanayakan, in conversation with the Sri Lankan journalist Faras Sakukatali on 29th March of 2021, in response, why the paranoia for having an investigation, said, the real issue is that the United Nations Human Rights Council or the General Assembly does not have the authority to substitute itself for the member states. This is a state responsibility for protecting human rights of the citizens of the country. The rights with its economic, social, cultural, and political rights are the rights of the people of the country, the rights to self-determination. The United Nations does not have the authority to intervene in the internal affairs of states, and those are the principles of the UN Charter. So the problem in the case of Sri Lanka is the UN has used human rights as a weapon, particularly since the collapse of the socialist bloc and US emerging as a hegemonic power, using the human rights as a way to expand and to consolidate its global domination. And to impose on the rest of the world a system a global order that is under its own leadership, which is contradictory to the global order, the UN Charter, which is based on sovereign equality. In the case of Sri Lanka, it is seeking to impose on Sri Lanka a particular model and to force Sri Lanka to accept the global alliance that the US is organizing right now is to counter China, which it sees as a primary adversary, to achieve the target to its global hegemony. Russia has become a target only in order to get the support of the European Union, in exchange that the US tells the EU, well, you must support us against China, in return we'll protect you against Russia. Creating a Russian boogie, a beast, as a threat, which it isn't to be seen. The United Nations has announced a budget of around $2.8 million to set up an office to collect evidence for future use on Sri Lanka. A means of setting the stage for military control and supremacy in the disguise, harping over the 30-year-old war crimes. This is not within the mandate of the General Assembly of the Human Rights Control Charter. The only organ that has the authority to do is the Security Council under Chapter 7 of the Charter, which is applied in case there is a breach of international law, or when there is a threat to international peace and security, or an act of aggression, and only in that situation can the Security Council even call for the ICC, International Criminal Court, to look into particular violations of criminal investigation, or create an ad hoc tribunal. China and Russia and the United States has the veto to move it out of the Security Council to the General Assembly. However, what the US House is trying to do is something they are not allowed to do under the UN Charter: to adopt the resolution within its own house and act upon it disregarding the UN Charter. A similar adoption by the General Assembly of a resolution that sets up a mechanism which is called the Independent Impartial Mechanism on Syria has been labeled to investigate and prepare the evidence and preserve evidence too in order to be used against Syria. To be used against Syria in any jurisdiction, rational or regional, or otherwise, for future, present use. A complete violation of the future of the UN Charter. In the case of Sri Lanka, it is exactly the same language that has been used in this resolution in the office report of the High Commissioner and the resolution itself. With just only displacement of words to put pressure on the Sri Lankan government. Because the US have an objective to use Sri Lanka's strategic location as well as its resources to achieve the hegemonic world domination and ambitions of the United States in the region. China is the primary adversary, and as we know, they have been trying to impose on Sri Lanka 3 defense agreements. One is the ACASA, or the other is SOFA, the other is MCC, leading to apprehensions that these pacts could pave the way for a US naval base in Sri Lanka, even turn the island into an American military colony, that they are trying to set up a new presidency internationally that permits the powerful countries to try citizens of other countries in their own courts. So we are back to a situation of colonization. If we can get beyond the waffle and talk and see how the people of Sri Lanka may suffer, from the latest rounds of talks at the United Nations in June, we must exercise pressure within Sri Lanka. It's not up to the Western countries who cannot teach Sri Lanka about the human rights violations or about war crimes to which they are gravely culpable. Under this pretext, I should reiterate, Sri Lanka has not, nor will, commit atrocity crimes, invade another country, or declare war on another race or religion to subjugate, conquer, and to impede. The ethical morals and principles behind the spirit of Sri Lanka lies in the noble adherence of its philosophical way of life. There should be no difference to any other country, rich or powerful, in this venture. The wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and Pakistan have taken a tremendous human toll. And as of November 2019, 335,000 civilians have died of violent deaths as a result of the wars. Civilian deaths have also resulted from the US military operations in Somalia and other countries in the US. War on terrorism. I refer Watson Institute of Brown University, article Cost of War. Today, terrorism is enacted in 2 fronts. One with unconventional and ruthless means, and the other by persuading the powerful big brother nations to fight a diplomatic war on behalf of the terrorist. A perfect example is what is happening between the Tamil diaspora terrorists using UN, Canada, UK and the USA to achieve its goals. proxy wars through political manipulation, vouching and threatening to take over the rights and freedom of a poor nation like Sri Lanka. And by listening to inexorable propagation of concocted lies with and highly advanced propaganda schemes that have infiltrated and penetrated to the influence or to influence the powerful politicians and the world's peacekeeping organizations, which the Tamils are master craftsmen. The resolution 413 encourages separatism and questions even the nature of the state, even the nature of the Sri Lanka state, by references to traditional Tamil homelands, clearly points out that this act of diplomatic intimidation has been instigated and funded by the so-called LTT diaspora, who was and still is being supported an armed terrorist organization that was defeated on May 18, 2009 with the killing of its leader Prabhakaran. The United States Congress and the UNHRC has fallen to the ploy and bitten the bullets, sucked it up and swallowed the pill of deceit, cleverly contrived and formulated by the LTT Tamil diaspora. There is a consistent pattern in the past that USA has been ignorant or carefree in identify its real true enemy, which has put the security concerns in jeopardy. Also, the Human Rights Watch of the UNHRC, dedicated to protecting the human rights around the world. Case in point, the United States Department of State's report on terrorism in 2016 about foreign terrorist organizations cites LTT Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam in these words: founded in 1976 and designated as a foreign terrorist organization on October 8th of 1997, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam is a Tamil secessionist group in Sri Lanka. Despite its military defeat at the hands of the Sri Lankan government in 2009, the LTT's international network of sympathizers and financial supporters has persisted, unquote. Dear honorable members of the Congress, these are the words coming out of your own State Department. USA, the country I made my home, among an elite freedom-loving people who have given the reins of justice to render without bias, equally to all people, irrespective of race, ethnicity, or religion. Am I being faulted by these dreams? Do you see, even now, after the war has ended with the LTT Tamils, the State Department of the US government says, I quote, there have been no known facts in Sri Lanka that could verifiably be attributed to the LTT since the end of the war in 2009. But a total of 13 LTT supporters, several of whom had allegedly planned attacks against US and Israeli diplomatic facilities in India were arrested in Malaysia in 2014. Additional LTTE members were arrested in Malaysia and India in 2015, one of whom was accused of exhorting other Sri Lankans to fund and revive the LTTE. Reference: County Reports of Terrorism 2016, Foreign Terrorist Organization, Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, United States Department of State, 19th July 2017. This report by the State Department on planned attacks on US and Israeli diplomatic facilities and urging other Sri Lankans to fund to revive the LTTE reveals that the LTTE is still alive and active, and the ignorance of the USA own security concerns about the LTTE and its front organizations. Any efforts in glorifying or supporting the LTTE diaspora will give inspiration to rump elements of the LTTE within the US and across the world, which might lead to an erroneous conclusion that the House supports armed acts to achieve political goals, as well as other terrorist organizations by administrations in both Democratic and Republican parties. Undermining the US administration's own foreign policy consistent with the warm bilateral relation between Sri Lanka as a partner to war against terrorism. If China is the issue that instigated to formulate the resolution 413, it is my suggestion for you to investigate China's policies that exploits the poor nations by corrupt practices, land grabs and contracts with the collaboration of corrupt politicians, and expel China from the UN Security Council. The US and the UNHRC should not be apprehensive about the unsubstantiated war crimes by Sri Lankan forces and heavy investments by China in Sri Lanka, as long as the Sri Lankans are drenched with democratic values and admire United States of America as a partner in upholding the values of democracy and in the fight of terrorism at its roots.